Hello everyone, thank you for joining me tonight. Before we get started, I would ask that you like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy my work. I really enjoy doing this, and your support means the world. I would also ask that you leave a comment saying where you are listening from and what time it is for you, as I absolutely love reading them. It is a quiet reminder that none of us are truly alone in the late hours. So, without further ado, let us begin. Imagine, if you will, a small village on the northeastern coast of what is now the United States, in a time long before the country existed as we know it today. This village was Salem, part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, settled by English Puritans seeking to build a community rooted in religious devotion and strict moral order. It is the year 1692, though the seeds of fear, suspicion, and unrest had been growing for decades. Salem was a place of contrasts. Its natural beauty was striking, with dense forests, rocky hills, and the sparkling waters of the Atlantic nearby. Yet life here was not easy. Winters were long and harsh, with snow blanketing the ground and temperatures dipping far below what the human body is comfortably accustomed to. Summers were brief and often wet, leaving farmers and villagers with limited time to tend crops and secure food for the colder months. The environment shaped both the economy and the mindset of the people. Survival depended not only on hard work, but also on a shared understanding of rules, order, and cooperation. The villagers of Salem were English settlers, deeply shaped by Puritan beliefs. They believed that life was a constant struggle between good and evil, between God and the devil, and that every action had moral consequences. Their worldview was simple in principle but exacting in practice. Obedience to God's laws was not only a spiritual duty, but also a matter of daily survival. Every member of the community was expected to live a life of piety, humility, and hard work, and deviation from these expectations could provoke suspicion or censure. The Puritans brought with them a fear of sin and a heightened awareness of evil. They believed that the devil was ever present, seeking to corrupt human souls and disrupt the community. This belief was not abstract. It was tangible and immediate. Illness, misfortune, or sudden accidents were often interpreted as evidence of the devil's influence. The line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and the villagers were vigilant in guarding against temptation, heresy, and unseen malevolent forces. Salem's society was tightly knit, and social cohesion was both a strength and a source of pressure. Families lived in small homes, often clustered near the church or town centre. Neighbours were closely aware of each other's behaviour, and gossip travelled quickly in such a close community. Reputation mattered greatly. A single accusation, a whispered suspicion, or a misunderstood action could follow someone for years. In Salem, social bonds were strong, but they also created fertile ground for fear and mistrust. Economically, Salem was a modest but active settlement. Farming was the primary occupation, though fishing, trade, and small-scale craftsmanship supplemented village life. Families grew corn, beans, and vegetables, tended livestock, and fished along the coast. Trade with nearby towns and other colonies brought essential goods, such as salt, tools, and fabric. Despite these activities, resources were limited, and competition for land, food, and opportunity could create tension between neighbors. Poverty and hardship were never far from anyone's experience. Education and religion were central to daily life. Boys and girls attended local schools when possible, learning to read the Bible and understand its teachings. Parents and ministers alike emphasized the importance of literacy, primarily to ensure that each member of the community could engage with Scripture. The local church was both a spiritual center and a hub of social organization. Attendance was expected, sermons were instructive and stern, and deviation from religious norms was met with correction or public admonishment. It was in this environment, one of intense piety, rigid social norms, and constant vigilance against evil, that the events of the Salem Witch Trials would unfold. Fear and suspicion were not only tolerated, but ingrained. The Puritan worldview demanded that the invisible world of spirits, angels, and demons was real, active, and sometimes threatening. Villagers were primed to see the hand of the devil in misfortune and to identify the individuals who might be in league with him. Salem was not unique in its beliefs or fears. Across Europe and the American colonies, communities had long been aware of witches, sorcery, and the dangers of demonic influence. The difference in Salem lay in the intensity and immediacy of suspicion. Here, every sudden illness, every crop failure, every unusual behavior could be interpreted as a sign of witchcraft. The tools of accusation were often subtle. A glance, a whisper, or a social slight could be enough to place someone under suspicion. Families in Salem were close-knit, and children were especially influenced by the beliefs of their elders. Young girls and boys were taught to recognize sin, obey moral laws, and fear the devil. They observed adults carefully, learning not only practical skills but also the expectations of piety and conduct. It would be these children in time who played a central role in the first accusations of witchcraft, their words and behaviors catalyzing a wave of hysteria that would engulf the village. The Puritan Church dictated both spiritual and civic life. Ministers held authority not only over religious instruction but also over social norms and community disputes. Town meetings, often held in the meeting house, provided a forum for decision-making, but decisions were guided by religious principles. The community's survival was closely tied to maintaining moral order and divine favor. Any sign of disruption, whether natural or human, was scrutinized for evidence of sin or devilish influence. Isolation also contributed to the intensity of fear. Salem was a relatively small village connected to other towns but still physically and socially contained. This isolation magnified rumors, limited alternative explanations for strange events, and reinforced a collective mindset that emphasized vigilance against hidden threats. Villagers were constantly aware of both internal and external dangers, from neighboring towns to the unseen forces they believed moved invisibly through their world. As we imagine life in Salem before the trials, picture families working diligently on their farms, children attending lessons in the small schoolhouse, and ministers delivering sermons with solemn authority. People move through their days with careful attention to morality, hygiene, and neighborly behavior. The landscape is both beautiful and challenging. Dense forests where wild animals roam, rivers that provide fish but can flood, and fields that must be planted and harvested with precision. The community is watchful, prayerful, and tightly connected, yet beneath the calm surface lies a readiness to see signs of danger everywhere. This was the world into which the first whispers of witchcraft would appear, a world ready to interpret ordinary misfortune as extraordinary evil, and where suspicion could spread faster than reason. The stage was set for events that would test the limits of trust, justice, and human psychology, leaving a legacy that has fascinated, alarmed, and taught lessons to generations long after. To understand why the Salem Witch Trials happened, we must first understand the minds of the people who lived there. The villagers of Salem were Puritans, a religious group that had left England to seek a purer form of Christianity. They believed that life was a constant struggle between God and the devil, between good and evil. Every action, every word, and even every thought carried spiritual weight. Obedience to God's laws was not just moral, it was essential for survival. The Puritans believed the devil was always at work, seeking to corrupt the faithful. They thought he could influence humans directly, tempting them into sin, or indirectly, by afflicting their neighbors with misfortune. A sudden illness, a crop failure, or an accident might not have a natural explanation in their eyes. Instead, such events could be signs that someone in the community had made a pact with the devil. This belief created a society intensely attentive to signs of evil. Villagers watched each other carefully, looking for behaviors that seemed unusual, secretive, or morally suspect. Accusations did not always arise from malice. Often they came from fear, confusion, or the need to explain misfortune. Children were taught to be alert, to recognize sin in themselves and others, and to fear the influence of unseen forces. Witchcraft was central to these fears. In the Puritan worldview, a witch was not merely someone who performed magic. A witch was someone who had allied with the devil, someone who sought to harm the innocent, disrupt the community, and threaten God's order. Witchcraft was considered both a spiritual and a social crime. It violated the laws of God, endangered neighbors, and challenged the authority of church and state. Stories of witches were common both in Europe and in the American colonies. Across the Atlantic, witch trials had taken place for centuries. England, Scotland, Germany, and other European nations had executed people accused of witchcraft, often based on spectral evidence, confessions, or public accusations. These stories traveled to the New World, carried in books, sermons, and the memories of settlers. Salem was not an isolated imagination. It was connected to a larger cultural understanding of witchcraft and its dangers. Puritan ministers played a key role in shaping fear of the devil. Their sermons often emphasized the presence of evil in the world and the importance of vigilance. Children and adults alike were reminded that sin could take many forms, that temptation was constant, and that God's justice would punish the wicked. The clergy provided both spiritual guidance and moral authority. They were responsible for interpreting events, identifying signs of sin, and instructing the community on proper conduct. The fear of witchcraft was not purely theoretical. The Puritans had lived through harsh winters, crop failures, disease, and conflict with native peoples. Life in colonial Massachusetts was precarious, and it made sense to many that spiritual forces could explain events beyond human control. Illnesses, livestock deaths, and sudden accidents were interpreted as evidence of supernatural influence. The line between natural misfortune and divine or diabolical punishment was blurred. Education reinforced these beliefs. Children learned to read the Bible, memorize verses, and understand the stories of sin and punishment. Moral instruction emphasized the consequences of disobedience and the need to remain pure. Villagers were taught to recognize the signs of temptation and to report wrongdoing. This education created a community in which fear of the unseen combined with obedience to authority became deeply ingrained. Witchcraft accusations could be triggered by almost anything. A neighbor's argument, a child's misbehavior, or a mysterious illness could all lead to suspicion. In Salem, even minor differences in behavior were noticed. A glance, a gesture, or a whispered comment could be enough to raise concern. In a tightly knit and religiously vigilant society, these small events could escalate into serious accusations. The Puritans also believed in the concept of spectral evidence. This meant that the devil could act through the body or spirit of a witch, causing harm even without the witch being physically present. For example, a villager might claim that while asleep they were attacked by the spectre of a neighbor. These claims were taken seriously, as the spiritual world was considered real, immediate, and dangerous. Spectral evidence made it easier for fear to spread because it relied on personal testimony and experience rather than physical proof. In addition to spiritual explanations, social factors influenced accusations. Salem was a small village with limited resources, where disputes over land, inheritance, and family conflicts were common. Accusations of witchcraft could sometimes reflect these underlying tensions. People were aware of grudges and rivalries, and fear could magnify minor disagreements into life-altering accusations. The combination of religious belief, fear of the devil, and social tension created a volatile environment. Women and children were particularly vulnerable in this context. Young girls were often the first to display unusual behavior, whether through illness, convulsions, or fits that could not be medically explained. Their words and actions were closely observed and interpreted as potential signs of supernatural influence. Women, especially those who were independent, outspoken, or socially marginalized, were more likely to be suspected of witchcraft. Social expectations and gender roles contributed to who became accused and who remained safe. The Puritan emphasis on moral vigilance created a society in which fear of the devil was ever present. Villagers interpreted everyday events through a lens of spiritual significance. A sudden cough, a missed sermon, or a disagreement could be seen as evidence of sin or diabolical influence. Children were taught to fear evil, adults were trained to detect it, and the community worked collectively to maintain order and purity. In this atmosphere, Salem was poised for conflict. The stage was set for accusations to arise, for fear to spread, and for ordinary misfortunes to be interpreted as extraordinary threats. The people of Salem, guided by faith, social expectations, and survival instincts, were ready to believe that witches walked among them. The Puritan worldview, steeped in the struggle between good and evil, created the perfect conditions for hysteria. As we imagine life in Salem before the trials, picture villagers moving cautiously through their days. Families tend crops and livestock, children recite Bible verses, and neighbors observe each other with careful attention. Ministers deliver sermons emphasizing sin and temptation, while rumors and suspicions quietly circulate. The forests surrounding the village are dark and mysterious, the river waters cold and unpredictable, and every misfortune is seen as potentially the work of the devil. It is within this web of fear, belief, and social pressure that the first accusations of witchcraft would emerge. The Puritan emphasis on moral vigilance, combined with environmental hardship and social tension, meant that a small spark could ignite widespread panic. The people of Salem, committed to their faith and fearful of evil, were both the actors and the audience in the unfolding drama of the witch trials. The year was 1692, and Salem Village was still a tightly knit community, shaped by Puritan beliefs and the constant awareness of spiritual danger. Life was difficult but predictable. Families worked the fields, tended livestock, and followed the strict codes of conduct imposed by faith and custom. Children attended school and memorized Bible verses. Ministers delivered solemn sermons, reminding everyone that the devil was ever present and that sin could lead to both spiritual and social consequences. It was in this structured environment that the first signs of the extraordinary began to appear. In the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, a minister respected for his position, but sometimes criticized for his stern demeanor, unusual events startled the household. Reverend Parris's young daughter, Betty Parris, and his niece Abigail Williams began exhibiting strange behaviors. They twitched, screamed, and fell into fits that doctors could not explain. Their limbs would jerk involuntarily, their voices would rise into eerie cries, and their eyes sometimes rolled back as if possessed. At first, the family sought medical explanations. Physicians of the time were limited in knowledge and often attributed sudden illness to imbalance in the humors or unknown ailments. Yet no remedy alleviated the girls' condition. Their behaviors continued, growing more dramatic and alarming, capturing the attention of neighbors and local leaders. Fear began to circulate. The villagers, already primed by Puritan teachings to see the hand of the devil, quickly interpreted these strange symptoms as evidence of witchcraft. The focus soon turned to Tituba, Reverend Parris's household servant. Tituba was an enslaved woman originally from the Caribbean, whose background, language, and customs were unfamiliar to the villagers. Her exotic appearance and mysterious rituals, which included telling stories and performing minor rituals for the children, made her a natural target for suspicion. When questioned about the girl's condition, Tituba admitted to practicing sorcery, though she claimed it was playful and innocent. Her confession, whether truthful or coerced, provided the first spark that ignited a wildfire of fear across the village. Once accusations took hold, they spread rapidly. The girls began naming others in the community as having afflicted them through witchcraft. The accusations were not necessarily grounded in reality. They were often fueled by fear, jealousy, or the desire to deflect blame. Neighbors, long aware of each other's private disputes and rivalries, suddenly found that ordinary disagreements could be interpreted as evidence of a dark and dangerous pact with the devil. The early accused were frequently marginalized individuals. Women who were poor, outspoken, or socially isolated became prime targets. Men who had been involved in disputes or who had challenged authority also found themselves under suspicion. The Puritan emphasis on moral vigilance and the belief that witches could disguise themselves as ordinary people meant that anyone could potentially be guilty. The community's collective imagination combined with existing social tensions, created an environment in which fear could flourish unchecked. As the accusations multiplied, the village leaders convened to respond. Reverend Paris, along with other ministers and magistrates, sought to identify the source of the evil and restore order. They examined the girls, listened to their claims, and questioned those accused. In the absence of clear evidence, the Puritan reliance on spiritual signs and confessions became central to the judicial process. Testimony, spectral evidence, and the demeanor of the accused were used as proof. The girls' accusations were dramatic and persuasive. They described being attacked by invisible forces, feeling pinched, pricked, or choked by unseen hands, and seeing apparitions of those who supposedly afflicted them. These accounts, vivid and terrifying, reinforced the villagers' belief that Salem was under siege by witches. The fear spread quickly. Families whispered about their neighbors. Children were warned to watch for signs of evil. The sense of danger became almost tangible, hanging over the village like a dark cloud. At the same time, personal motives often influenced the accusations. Land disputes, inheritance conflicts, and long-standing grudges could be masked by the language of witchcraft. A woman who had quarreled with a neighbor might suddenly be accused of harming children through spells. A family that had been involved in a contentious legal matter might find themselves named in spectral visions. Fear and suspicion provided cover for grievances that had simmered for years. One of the earliest prominent accused was Sarah Good, a woman who lived on the margins of the community. She was poor, often begging for food, and sometimes expressed her dissatisfaction with her circumstances. When the girls accused her of witchcraft, the villagers readily believed it. Sarah Good's social position, her outspoken nature, and her misfortune made her an easy target. Similarly, Sarah Osborne, an older woman who had spent time away from the village due to illness, was accused. These women became the first to face the harsh machinery of Puritan justice. Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were soon brought before local magistrates for questioning. Their confessions, denials, or partial admissions set the tone for what was to come. Spectral evidence, dreams, and visions were treated as valid testimony. Even the smallest indication of guilt, a nervous glance, a hesitant answer, or a trembling voice, could seal a person's fate. The system of justice, built on religious conviction and fear, left little room for rational doubt. The early accusations also reveal the role of children in the trials. Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and other young girls were not simply passive witnesses. They were central actors. Their words could condemn a neighbor, their gestures could convince a magistrate, and their accusations could ignite community-wide panic. The combination of youth, innocence, and theatrical behavior gave them a unique authority in the eyes of the villagers. Adults, already inclined to fear the devil, were persuaded that these children were channels of divine revelation. By the end of the initial phase, the village was in a state of heightened anxiety. Every household, every neighbor, and every child could be both observer and target. Fear of witchcraft permeated conversations, disrupted daily routines, and created tension in every home. The sense of order that had defined Salem life was eroding, replaced by suspicion and uncertainty. Ordinary events, a sudden illness, a misbehaving child, or a minor argument were interpreted as signs of a larger, unseen threat. The first accusations in Salem were more than isolated incidents. They were the spark that ignited a broader conflagration. Once the community accepted that witches could exist among them, the mechanism of fear became self-reinforcing. Every new accusation lent credibility to the previous ones. The social, religious, and psychological conditions of the village allowed this pattern to continue and intensify. In imagining this period, picture Salem villagers moving cautiously through their days, always alert to signs of evil. Families whisper about unusual behavior, children play in the streets, while adults observe for signs of sin, and ministers deliver sermons warning of the devil's influence. The forests surrounding the village are dense and shadowed, the river waters cold and unpredictable, and the ordinary rhythms of life are punctuated by fear, suspicion, and the knowledge that the unseen world may be watching. It was from this tense, fearful environment that the Salem Witch Trials would grow. The first accusations were not merely the actions of a few individuals. They were the product of a complex web of belief, fear, and social dynamics. In the weeks and months to follow, these initial accusations would spiral outward, engulfing the village in hysteria, tragedy, and enduring historical significance. Once the first accusations were made in Reverend Parris's household, fear in Salem village spread like wildfire. The initial claims of witchcraft by Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and the other girls quickly escalated beyond the walls of the Parris home. Villagers, already attuned to the Puritan belief in the constant presence of the devil, interpreted each strange event, each illness, and each accident as potential evidence of witchcraft. Panic began to ripple through the community. Neighbors whispered about the sudden ailments of children, the mysterious behavior of livestock, and the subtle tensions between families. Every minor incident could be seen as a sign of dark forces at work. People became hyper-vigilant, watching each other for unusual gestures, words, or actions. The fear was both pervasive and contagious, spreading quickly through the tightly knit social fabric of the village. The early victims of suspicion were often those who were socially vulnerable: widows, the poor, the outspoken, and those who had been involved in disputes with others were disproportionately accused. The villagers, steeped in fear of the devil and committed to protecting their community, accepted these accusations with little skepticism. The combination of religious conviction and social tension made Salem a fertile ground for a rapidly escalating crisis. As accusations multiplied, the village leaders were compelled to act. Reverend Parris, along with other ministers and magistrates, convened meetings to address the growing panic. They sought to determine whether the afflictions of the children and the claims of witchcraft were real, and if so, who among the villagers was responsible. Their goal was not only to restore order, but also to ensure that divine justice was served in accordance with Puritan beliefs. The first formal legal proceedings began when magistrates examined those accused of witchcraft. They relied heavily on the testimony of the girls, who provided vivid and terrifying accounts of being tormented by invisible forces. These testimonies were taken seriously because, in the Puritan worldview, the spiritual realm was real and immediate. Spectral evidence, the idea that the devil could act through a person's spirit or shape, became a central tool in identifying alleged witches. Even when physical proof was absent, the word of the afflicted was enough to implicate someone. One of the earliest accused, Tituba, confessed under pressure. Her admission, whether truthful or coerced, fueled the fear of witchcraft in Salem. She described dark rituals and claimed that other villagers were involved in diabolical plots. These confessions, combined with the girls' accusations, created a narrative that reinforced the community's fears. Soon, more names were added to the list, and the circle of suspicion expanded to include friends, neighbors, and relatives. The spread of accusations was not uniform. Some families were more affected than others, and some individuals were targeted repeatedly. Social standing, personal grievances, and visibility in the community influenced who was accused. A family in conflict with another household might suddenly be implicated, while a person who had angered a neighbor could find themselves under intense scrutiny. Fear, suspicion, and social dynamics combined in unpredictable ways, creating a climate in which anyone could be accused. As more people were named, formal examinations and hearings were organized. Magistrates such as John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin conducted sessions to question the accused. They listened carefully to the girls' testimonies, observing their gestures, reactions, and descriptions of spiritual torment. The accused were often terrified, unsure how to respond in a system where denial could be interpreted as guilt and admission could lead to punishment. The psychological pressure was immense. Public attention intensified as well. Villagers gathered to witness examinations and hearings, and the events became both a legal process and a communal spectacle. The fear of witchcraft was reinforced by the collective observation of others. Rumors circulated, and stories of apparitions, convulsions, and spectral attacks spread quickly. Each account, no matter how exaggerated, contributed to the growing hysteria. The early trials also revealed the role of children as central actors in the hysteria. Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and other young girls were not only witnesses, they became instruments through which fear was projected and validated. Their testimonies, often detailed and dramatic, could condemn a neighbor or relative. The girls' ability to convince adults of their experiences demonstrates both the power of belief and the vulnerability of a society steeped in fear. Among the first prominent accused beyond Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, were women who were outspoken, socially marginal, or otherwise vulnerable. Each accusation added credibility to the previous ones, creating a reinforcing cycle. The village increasingly viewed the problem not as isolated incidents, but as evidence of a widespread conspiracy of witches working with the devil. By the summer of 1692, Salem's panic had spread to neighboring towns. Villages in the surrounding countryside reported similar strange behaviors, unexplained illnesses, and suspicions of witchcraft. Ministers and magistrates in these towns watched closely, aware of the events in Salem, and concerned about the possibility of similar outbreaks. The network of fear extended beyond Salem village, illustrating the contagious nature of hysteria in tightly connected communities. The combination of religious belief, environmental stress, and social tension created conditions in which ordinary events could be interpreted as supernatural threats. A child's sudden illness, a disagreement over property, or a moment of misbehavior could trigger an accusation. The villagers' commitment to moral vigilance, coupled with the belief in the devil's active presence, meant that even minor incidents could escalate into life-altering consequences. In this period, the early trials were a mixture of legal procedure and spiritual theater. Examinations relied on observation, interpretation of symptoms, and the credibility of the girls' accounts. Magistrates had limited tools, and the reliance on spectral evidence was a reflection of the prevailing worldview. The system functioned according to religious logic rather than empirical reasoning, and in such a system, fear could easily overwhelm fairness. As the accusations continued, the community became deeply polarized. Families were divided, friendships were strained, and the sense of normalcy in daily life eroded. Fear dominated conversations, work routines, and social gatherings. The constant vigilance required to detect sin and witchcraft created an environment of psychological stress, where suspicion could flourish unchecked. It is within this climate of fear that the early trials set the stage for the larger legal machinery that would soon take over. The Court of Odia and Termina would be established to handle the growing number of cases, formalizing the process and accelerating the hysteria. The small, intimate community of Salem, once governed by local ministers and magistrates, would now see the law intertwined with spiritual conviction in unprecedented ways. By imagining these early days, we can picture Salem villagers moving cautiously through their routines, watching each other with nervous attention. Families tend their farms, children play with a mix of curiosity and caution, and neighbors exchange rumors under the shadow of fear. Every minor misfortune or unexplained occurrence is scrutinized for signs of witchcraft. Ministers deliver sermons warning of the devil's reach, reinforcing both vigilance and anxiety. The village is poised on the edge of hysteria, ready for the extraordinary events that will soon engulf it. The spread of panic and early trials demonstrates the power of fear, belief, and social dynamics in shaping human behavior. The events in Salem were not simply the result of a few individuals' actions, they were the product of a community deeply primed to see the world in terms of spiritual conflict. As accusations multiplied, the mechanisms of fear and suspicion reinforced themselves, setting the stage for one of the most infamous episodes in colonial American history. As the accusations in Salem village multiplied, the local magistrates realized that the usual town procedures were insufficient to handle the growing crisis. Ordinary courts and church-led inquiries could not keep up with the sheer number of complaints, the intensity of fear, and the complex social dynamics involved. To address the situation, the colonial government of Massachusetts took a decisive step. They established a special court known as the Court of Odia and Termina in the spring of 1692. The name, derived from an Old English term meaning to hear and determine, reflected its purpose: to hear cases of witchcraft and issue judgments. The creation of the court marked a turning point in the Salem Witch Trials. Before its establishment, examinations had been informal and localized, often conducted by ministers or magistrates in the village. With the court of Oya and Termina, cases were centralized, procedures became more formalized, and the power of the legal system was fully brought to bear. This gave the trials a sense of official authority, reinforcing the villagers' belief that they were witnessing a divine struggle manifesting in their community. The court was presided over by judges appointed by the colonial governor, most notably Samuel Sewall, William Stoughton, and John Hathorne. These men were deeply devout, committed to Puritan principles, and convinced that witches posed a genuine threat to the moral and spiritual order. Their decisions reflected the prevailing beliefs of the time, and they relied heavily on testimony that today would be considered unreliable, such as spectral evidence, the claim that the spirit or spectre of an accused individual had harmed another. Spectral evidence became a cornerstone of the court's proceedings. Witnesses, often children, would testify that they saw the apparitions of accused witches attacking them or causing harm. For example, a girl might claim that while asleep she was pinched, scratched, or choked by the spirit of a neighbor. In the Puritan worldview, these accounts were credible. The judges believed that the devil could allow his followers to project their image invisibly into the world, making these visions genuine evidence of witchcraft. The reliance on spectral evidence, combined with the dramatic testimonies of children, gave the court a sense of immediacy and urgency. Cases were tried quickly, and the accused were often pressed to confess or name others. Confessions, whether coerced or voluntarily given, were considered valuable. They not only confirmed the presence of witchcraft, but also expanded the web of suspicion, leading to new accusations and additional arrests. This created a self-reinforcing cycle in which fear, accusation, and judgment fed upon each other. One of the first to be tried under the court's authority was Tituba, Reverend Paris's servant. Her confession was both detailed and alarming. She admitted to practicing magic, interacting with spirits, and even claiming that others in the village were involved in witchcraft. Her testimony set a precedent and provided the court with a framework for how to interpret the events unfolding in Salem. Following Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were tried, and the court quickly established the pattern that would dominate the trials for months to come. The court's proceedings were formal but tense. The accused were brought before judges and witnesses, questioned about their supposed practices, and observed for signs of guilt. Their responses were carefully scrutinized. Any hesitation, inconsistency, or display of emotion could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. In this environment, rational defense was almost impossible. Denial could appear evasive, and confession could be coerced by fear of execution or torture. The pressure on the accused was immense, and the psychological toll was severe. Public participation further amplified the intensity of the trials. Villagers gathered to observe examinations, listened to the dramatic testimonies of the afflicted, and whispered about the names being called. Fear was communal. It spread not only through personal observation, but also through collective attention. The court, in effect, operated as both a legal body and a stage for moral instruction, reinforcing the Puritan belief that the devil was actively at work in their midst. Executions soon followed. The court of Oya and Termina had the authority to impose the ultimate punishment, hanging. The first executed included women like Bridget Bishop, whose eccentric behavior and social independence had made her a target. Public hangings were not only punitive, but also demonstrative. They served as warnings to the community about the dangers of sin, the power of the devil, and the importance of vigilance. Families watched, children observed, and the message was clear: witchcraft was a crime with deadly consequences. The court's actions had a profound effect on the social dynamics of Salem. Accusations were no longer confined to personal grudges or village disputes. They became matters of life and death under formal legal authority. Fear became institutionalized. The legal system, which might have been expected to protect the innocent, instead became a tool that validated and amplified the hysteria. Individuals were caught in a system that was designed to detect moral and spiritual corruption, yet relied on evidence that was largely intangible and subjective. As the trials progressed, more and more villagers were drawn into the vortex of accusation and judgment. Families were torn apart. Children were taught to distrust neighbors. The once ordinary rhythms of daily life were overshadowed by constant vigilance, fear, and anxiety. Work in the fields, preparation of meals, and attendance at church were all conducted under the shadow of suspicion. Even routine interactions became fraught with tension, as any perceived slight or unusual behavior could spark new accusations. The court of Oya and Termina also encouraged the expansion of accusations to others beyond Salem village. Nearby towns began reporting similar cases. Ministers and magistrates, observing the developments in Salem, were alerted to potential outbreaks in their own communities. The hysteria, fueled by formal legal proceedings, spread beyond its original boundaries, demonstrating the contagious nature of fear in a society attuned to spiritual threats. At the same time, criticism and concern began to emerge, although it was limited at first. Some ministers and community leaders questioned the reliance on spectral evidence and the rapid escalation of accusations. Doubts existed quietly in the background, but the momentum of fear reinforced by legal authority made skepticism difficult to voice. The court's procedures, intended to enforce justice, were instead creating a cycle in which accusation and judgment continually reinforced each other. The establishment of the Court of Oya and Termina represents a critical moment in the Salem Witch Trials. It transformed what had been local suspicions into a formalized, legally sanctioned process. It gave credibility to spectral evidence and children's testimonies. It enabled rapid trials and executions, and perhaps most importantly, it institutionalized fear, ensuring that the hysteria would continue to grow for months to come. In imagining this period, picture Salem villagers walking cautiously through their lives. Families tend livestock and harvest crops with careful attention. Children are observed for any unusual behavior. Neighbors whisper about suspicions and share reports of apparitions or strange illnesses. Ministers deliver sermons reinforcing the dangers of the devil and the necessity of vigilance. The court convenes, questioning the accused and listening intently to the stories of the afflicted. Every day is marked by tension, fear, and the possibility that anyone, regardless of age or status, could be accused. The Court of Oya and Termina, with its authority, procedures, and reliance on spiritual testimony, accelerated the Salem Witch Trials. It transformed a small, localized fear into a wide-reaching, legally sanctioned hysteria. What began as mysterious fits and troubling behavior in the Paris household had now become a community-wide crisis, with life and death consequences for dozens of villagers. The legal machinery was in motion, and the village of Salem would never again experience ordinary, untroubled days. By mid-1692, the Salem Witch Trials had begun to engulf the village in fear and suspicion. The initial accusations had spiraled into a wave of formal charges, and the Court of Oya and Termina was now handling dozens of cases. It was in this period that certain individuals became central figures, both as accused witches and as authorities overseeing the trials. Understanding their stories helps illuminate the social, religious, and psychological dynamics that fueled the hysteria. One of the first notable cases involved Bridget Bishop, a woman in her mid-40s known for her lively personality and her somewhat unconventional lifestyle. Bridget had previously been involved in disputes with neighbors, and her behavior often drew attention. She was accused of practicing witchcraft after the afflicted girls claimed to have been attacked by her spectre. Bridget's trial was highly publicized, and her defiant demeanor in court may have contributed to the perception of guilt. Ultimately, she was found guilty and executed by hanging on June 10, 1692. Her case set a precedent and instilled fear throughout the village, demonstrating that social standing or personality could not protect one from accusation. Another prominent figure was Sarah Good, a woman of lower social standing who often begged for food. She had long been marginalized in the community, and had a reputation for speaking out against neighbors or expressing dissatisfaction with her circumstances. When the girls accused her of witchcraft, the villagers accepted the claim with little hesitation. Sarah Good was interrogated by the court, pressured to confess, and ultimately condemned to death. Her execution reinforced the notion that the most vulnerable members of society were often the first targets of witchcraft accusations. Sarah Osborne was also among the early accused, an older woman who had spent significant time away from the village due to illness. Sarah Osborne had limited social influence and few allies. She was accused of witchcraft largely because she did not conform to social expectations, including attending church regularly. Her marginalization made her an easy target. The court found her guilty, further fueling the wave of fear that permeated Salem village. The accusations were not limited to women. Several men were also caught in the hysteria, particularly those who had been involved in disputes or held unpopular views. George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, was accused of witchcraft after tensions arose between him and members of the community. Burroughs' case illustrates how social conflict, combined with fear and religious fervor, could lead to charges of witchcraft even against respected figures. He was eventually executed, highlighting that no one was entirely safe once the hysteria took hold. Among the judges overseeing these cases, William Stoughton played a particularly influential role. Appointed as the chief magistrate of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, Stoughton was deeply committed to Puritan principles and the belief that witches posed a genuine threat to the spiritual and social order. He was a staunch advocate for the admissibility of spectral evidence, and his decisions often reinforced the credibility of the girls' testimonies. Stoughton's rulings contributed to the rapid escalation of trials and the increasing number of executions. Samuel Sewall, another judge, was somewhat more cautious, but still operated within the same religious framework. Sewall's diary entries later revealed personal doubts and remorse over the outcomes of the trials, but during the events themselves he followed the procedures of the court. His reflections provide valuable insight into the internal conflict experienced by those involved in the judicial process. Even men of conscience found themselves complicit in a system that allowed fear and superstition to dictate life and death decisions. The young girls who had initiated the hysteria remained central figures throughout this period. Abigail Williams and Betty Paris continued to exhibit dramatic fits and to accuse others of witchcraft. Their testimonies shaped the proceedings and directed the court's attention toward specific individuals. The girls' behavior, combined with the court's reliance on spectral evidence, ensured that accusations could multiply rapidly. Children's voices, once considered innocent, had become instruments of judgment and fear. As more cases unfolded, the social dynamics of Salem became increasingly complex. Families were divided, friendships strained, and long-standing grievances resurfaced. A minor dispute over property or inheritance could now be reframed as evidence of witchcraft. Social vulnerability, combined with the perception of moral or spiritual deficiency, increased the likelihood of being accused. The trials revealed the underlying tensions in a tightly knit village and how easily those tensions could be exploited under the guise of spiritual vigilance. One of the most tragic aspects of the trials was the way confessions were extracted. Accused individuals were often subjected to intense psychological pressure, and many ultimately confessed to crimes they may not have committed. These confessions, once given, were used to implicate others, expanding the web of suspicion. Fear of execution, coupled with the desire to save oneself, created a system in which the truth became almost irrelevant. Survival often meant participating in the accusation of others. The case of Tituba, the Paris household servant, is particularly illustrative. Initially confessing to minor sorcery, she eventually implicated other villagers in her testimony, whether coerced or strategic. Her statements lent credibility to the girls' accounts and encouraged further accusations. Tituba's case demonstrates how an individual's position in society, marginalized, different, or exoticized, could make them both a target and a catalyst for broader hysteria. Other accused individuals, like Martha Corey, who was respected and morally upright, show the indiscriminate nature of suspicion. Martha Corey was accused after she expressed skepticism about the validity of the girl's fits and the legitimacy of the accusations. Her case illustrates that even those with strong social standing and a reputation for piety were not immune, once fear had taken hold. The logic of the trials had shifted. Skepticism could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft itself. In addition to social standing and reputation, gender played a critical role in the Salem Witch Trials. Women were disproportionately accused, particularly those who were independent, outspoken, or socially marginal. The Puritan emphasis on female piety and domestic submission meant that women who deviated from these norms were more likely to be suspected. Men were also accused, but women bore the brunt of the hysteria, reflecting broader social expectations and anxieties about gender roles. The personal stories of those involved reveal the human cost of the trials. Families were torn apart, friendships destroyed, and reputations ruined. The accused faced unimaginable stress, fear, and uncertainty, often without recourse to a fair defense. Even those who survived the trials were left with lasting psychological and social scars. The trials created a climate in which fear, suspicion, and religious zeal combined to produce consequences that were devastating and often irreversible. The judges, ministers, and accusers each played roles within a larger system shaped by belief, fear, and social dynamics. The individuals at the center of the Salem Witch Trials were not merely characters in a historical narrative. They were real people navigating extraordinary circumstances, often caught between personal conscience and communal pressure. Their stories provide insight into the interplay of religion, social hierarchy, and human psychology that made the hysteria possible. As we reflect on these prominent cases and individuals, we can imagine the village of Salem in the summer of 1692. Families move cautiously through their days, watching for signs of misfortune or unusual behavior. Ministers deliver sermons warning of the devil's influence. Neighbors whisper about the names being called in court, and children are observed for any sign of affliction. Every household is touched by fear, and every individual is aware that life could change dramatically with a single accusation. The stories of Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Tituba, Martha Corey, and others remind us that the Salem Witch Trials were not abstract events. They were human experiences filled with fear, anxiety, and tragedy. The individuals involved were both victims and actors in a system that reflected the fears, beliefs, and social tensions of their time. Understanding their stories helps us grasp the full scope of the hysteria and the mechanisms that allowed it to escalate so rapidly. The Salem Witch Trials, with their prominent cases and central figures, illustrate how a combination of belief, fear, and social dynamics can produce extraordinary consequences. The events of 1692 would leave an enduring mark on the community, shaping both the legal and cultural history of colonial Massachusetts. And yet, as the trials continued, the human cost would deepen, setting the stage for the subsequent waves of accusation, imprisonment, and execution that would define this dark chapter in history. By the summer of 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had grown far beyond the initial accusations in Reverend Parris's household. What had begun with a few mysterious fits and troubling behaviors had transformed into a sweeping wave of fear and suspicion that touched nearly every corner of the village. The court system, fueled by testimony, spectral evidence, and confessions, had created an environment in which the boundaries between reality and imagination were dangerously blurred. The number of accusations multiplied rapidly. Once the court of Oyer and Terminer was established, villagers recognized that even the smallest grievance, the slightest quirk of behavior, or the simplest misunderstanding could become a matter of life and death. Families found themselves naming neighbors, sometimes under pressure, sometimes in an attempt to protect themselves from suspicion. The mechanism of fear, once activated, proved almost impossible to halt. Social tensions within Salem Village played a major role in the escalation. Land disputes, personal rivalries, and long-standing resentments resurfaced, often framed in the language of witchcraft. A neighbor's cow falling ill could be interpreted as a curse, A disagreement over property boundaries might be reframed as evidence of diabolical influence. Ordinary frustrations became proof of spiritual corruption. The fear that someone might be secretly working for the devil transformed minor disputes into dramatic accusations. As accusations multiplied, the psychological climate of the village deteriorated. Families lived under constant stress, watching for signs of affliction in children or neighbors. Daily routines were disrupted as work in the fields, household chores and church attendance were overshadowed by anxiety. People whispered behind closed doors, wondering who might be accused next. The village had become a place where suspicion was as natural as breathing, and trust was in short supply. Children remained central to the spreading hysteria. The girls whose initial fits had sparked the crisis, Abigail Williams, Betty Paris, and others, continued to act as key witnesses. Their accounts grew more elaborate and specific, naming a wider circle of villagers and describing ever more frightening spectral attacks. The drama of their testimony captured the attention of adults and reinforced the perception that the devil's influence was pervasive. The cases now extended beyond the most socially vulnerable. Even those with strong social standing, respected reputations, and devout piety found themselves at risk. Martha Corey, a woman known for her skepticism of the girls' claims, was accused despite her moral integrity. Her refusal to endorse the legitimacy of the afflictions was interpreted as evidence of witchcraft itself. The logic of the trials had shifted. Questioning the process or expressing doubt could be as dangerous as committing the supposed crimes. The expansion of accusations also revealed the role of the legal system in sustaining hysteria. Judges such as William Stoughton and John Hathorne relied heavily on spectral evidence, giving credibility to the girls' visions and claims. Once admitted, this type of evidence was difficult to refute. A claim that someone's spectre had harmed another, even in a dream, could lead to formal charges. This legal validation of fear made it increasingly likely that accusations would continue and spread. Public trials became both judicial and performative. Villagers attended hearings to witness examinations of the accused, often hearing the children describe their spectral torment in vivid detail. The drama of the courtroom reinforced the belief that witches were everywhere and that vigilance was essential. Fear, reinforced by communal observation, became an organizing principle of daily life. The events of the courtroom spilled into the village itself, influencing behavior and social interactions. As the summer progressed, the number of people accused grew steadily. In addition to Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Martha Corey, other women such as Elizabeth Proctor and Rebecca Nurse were brought before the court. Their cases highlight the arbitrariness and reach of the hysteria. Elizabeth Proctor was accused partially because of personal animosities and partially because her family had previous conflicts with neighbors. Rebecca Nurse, a respected elder, was accused despite her long history of pious service and the high regard in which she was held. These examples demonstrate that no social position offered immunity once fear had taken hold. Men, too, were not immune. Individuals such as George Burroughs, the former minister, faced accusations in part because of personal disputes, in part because of suspicions surrounding his role in the community. Burroughs' case illustrates how social tension and fear could override rational judgment, targeting those who were previously trusted or respected. His eventual execution underscored the idea that status provided little protection. Accusations often followed patterns influenced by social dynamics. Marginalized individuals, outspoken critics, and those who deviated from expected behaviors were frequent targets. Families with ongoing disputes were more likely to be implicated. Even those who sought to defend themselves risked appearing guilty. The legal system, combined with a climate of fear, encouraged individuals to accuse others to deflect suspicion or to survive. Confessions played a critical role in fueling the escalating hysteria. Accused individuals, often terrified and facing the possibility of execution, sometimes admitted to witchcraft. These confessions frequently included claims that others in the village were also involved. The admission of guilt, whether coerced or voluntary, became evidence against others. This created a cycle in which accusation, confession, and conviction reinforced each other, making it almost inevitable that more names would be added to the list of the condemned. The psychological effects on the community were profound. Adults were consumed by fear, constantly evaluating neighbors and family members for signs of guilt. Children were trained to be vigilant, observing behavior that might suggest diabolical influence. Ordinary life, working in the fields, tending animals, or preparing meals, was overshadowed by the possibility of accusation. The communal stress was relentless, and even minor missteps could become evidence of witchcraft. The court's procedures, while intended to enforce justice, effectively legitimized the spread of hysteria. Spectral evidence and the dramatic testimonies of children created a system in which fear dictated outcomes. The legal process, rather than providing protection, became a mechanism for amplifying panic. In this environment, social tensions, personal grievances, and religious zeal intersected with deadly consequences. By mid-1692, the Salem Witch Trials had entered a stage in which the number of victims, the intensity of fear, and the reach of the legal system created a self-perpetuating cycle. Accusations generated arrests, arrests prompted trials, and trials encouraged further accusations. Communities surrounding Salem Village became aware of the crisis, and reports of similar afflictions and suspicions began to emerge. The hysteria was no longer confined to one village. It was spreading, demonstrating the contagious nature of fear in tightly knit, religiously minded societies. In imagining this period, picture the villagers of Salem moving cautiously through their daily lives. Families watch their children closely. Neighbors exchange nervous glances and whispered warnings. Ministers deliver sermons emphasizing vigilance, morality, and the ever-present danger of the devil. The courthouse becomes a center of both legal authority and moral theater, where accusations, confessions, and judgments unfold publicly. Every day is marked by tension, and every person is aware that life could change dramatically with a single accusation. The escalation of accusations and widening hysteria in Salem demonstrates how fear, belief, and social dynamics can combine to create extraordinary consequences. The human cost was immense: families torn apart, reputations destroyed, and lives lost. At the same time, the mechanisms of fear reveal how communities, when operating under intense social, religious, and psychological pressures, can turn against themselves in ways that are both tragic and instructive for future generations. By the summer and fall of 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had reached their most tragic and intense phase. Accusations had escalated beyond the initial cases, and the Court of Oyer and Terminer was handling dozens of trials. The village had become a place where suspicion and fear dominated everyday life, and the consequences of accusation were increasingly deadly. The court wielded significant authority over the accused. Once individuals were charged with witchcraft, they could be arrested and imprisoned while awaiting trial. Conditions in the jails were harsh, and overcrowding became a serious problem as more people were detained. The Essex County Jail, where many of the accused were held, was not designed for long-term confinement. Prisoners often endured cold, damp cells, poor sanitation, and minimal food. These conditions exacerbated stress and illness, adding to the suffering of those awaiting judgment. Imprisonment itself became a form of punishment. Families who had previously been respected members of the community now experienced social stigma. Children of the accused were often ostracized or left in the care of neighbors. The psychological toll of confinement, combined with the uncertainty of trial outcomes, created an environment of fear and despair. Even before the trials concluded, the accused were subjected to a form of social and emotional punishment. Executions were public events, intended not only to punish, but also to reinforce social and moral order. Hanging was the primary method used in Salem, and the first execution under the Court of Oyer and Terminer was that of Bridget Bishop in June of 1692. Her death served as a stark warning to the community about the consequences of witchcraft. Public hangings were attended by large crowds, who witnessed the execution as both a spectacle and a moral lesson. The presence of community members heightened the sense of urgency and reinforced the belief that the devil was at work in Salem. As the trials continued, more victims were sentenced to death. Prominent cases included Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Rebecca Nurse, and Giles Corey. Rebecca Nurse, a respected elder, was executed despite widespread sympathy and protests. Her conviction highlighted the precariousness of social standing in a climate dominated by fear. Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, met a particularly brutal fate. He was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Corey's resistance underscored both the harshness of the judicial system and the desperation of those caught in its grasp. The executions were both horrifying and instructive for the village. They reinforced the perception that the devil's influence was real and that spiritual vigilance was essential. Families witnessed the deaths of neighbors, friends, and relatives, internalizing the lesson that no one was safe from accusation. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victims, creating a climate in which fear and conformity dominated behavior. While some were executed quickly, others remained imprisoned for months. The legal process was slow, and the reliance on spectral evidence and testimony created a cycle in which accusations bred further accusations. Prisoners could be released if there was insufficient evidence, or if confessions were obtained, but this was rare. Many families endured prolonged anxiety, unsure whether their loved ones would survive the ordeal. The public nature of executions served multiple purposes. They were a demonstration of the court's authority, a warning to the community, and a reinforcement of religious belief. Ministers often delivered sermons before and after hangings, framing the events as the consequences of sin and the vigilance required to resist the devil. These sermons intertwined morality, fear, and spectacle, making the events both religious instruction and social control. Children were not exempt from the hysteria and its consequences. Several children were accused, imprisoned, and subjected to intense questioning. The psychological stress on these young individuals was immense as they navigated the dual roles of witnesses and potential victims. Their participation in trials as witnesses lent credibility to accusations, but also placed them under extraordinary pressure. Many of the children's experiences would leave lasting scars, shaping their understanding of authority, morality, and fear. The pace of executions accelerated in the late summer of 1692. Once accused, individuals faced the possibility of swift judgment. Judges such as William Stoughton were committed to maintaining order and demonstrating the consequences of witchcraft. The use of spectral evidence, combined with the dramatic testimonies of the afflicted, created a system in which the accused had limited options. Denial could be interpreted as guilt, and confession often required implicating others, further fueling the cycle of hysteria. Some accused attempted to defend themselves by appealing to character witnesses or demonstrating piety. Figures such as Rebecca Nurse had long histories of moral integrity, yet these appeals were frequently dismissed. In a system dominated by fear and suspicion, rational arguments often failed to sway the court. The reliance on intangible evidence, such as visions or spiritual attacks, meant that even the most virtuous individuals could be condemned. Imprisonment also became a social crucible. Families who had been prosperous or respected found themselves vulnerable. Children were forced to navigate the stigma associated with having a parent or sibling accused. Social networks were strained as neighbors debated whether to offer support or distance themselves. The psychological and social consequences extended far beyond the courtroom, affecting every facet of village life. Executions were intended to be both punitive and deterrent. They demonstrated the consequences of witchcraft while reinforcing the court's authority and the moral order of the community. The deaths of individuals such as Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, and Giles Corey were reminders to the villagers of the stakes involved. Yet the spectacle of execution also heightened fear, making the community more receptive to further accusations. By autumn of 1692, the cumulative effect of imprisonment and executions created a climate of pervasive anxiety. Villagers adjusted their behavior, becoming hyper-vigilant and cautious. The fear of accusation influenced social interactions, work routines, and family life. Communities surrounding Salem Village were also affected as news of the trials spread, and neighboring towns reported similar fears of witchcraft. The combination of formal legal authority, public execution, and social observation ensured that hysteria became self-reinforcing. Accusations bred arrests, arrests prompted trials, trials led to executions, and executions increased fear. Families became both observers and participants in a cycle that was difficult to escape. The mechanisms of fear, suspicion, and judgment intertwined, shaping the daily lives of every villager. Imprisonment, public execution, and the constant threat of accusation created lasting trauma. Survivors faced not only the grief of losing family members and friends, but also the social stigma of having been implicated or associated with the accused. Communities would remember the trials for generations, embedding lessons about fear, morality, and the consequences of mass hysteria in the cultural memory of New England. By the close of 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had reached a turning point. Executions continued, but skepticism and criticism began to emerge. Some ministers, judges, and villagers questioned the validity of spectral evidence and the morality of condemning individuals based on fear and testimony. These doubts would eventually contribute to the suspension of the Court of Oyer and Termina and the release of many prisoners. Yet, during the peak of the trials, the combination of imprisonment, execution, and communal fear created an environment in which the human cost was extraordinarily high. In imagining this period, picture Salem villagers gathering to witness hangings. Families watch anxiously, children observe the court's proceedings, and ministers frame the events as lessons in morality and vigilance. Prisoners endure harsh conditions, awaiting judgment, while neighbors whisper about the names called in court. Fear permeates daily life, influencing every interaction and decision. The village exists in a state of heightened anxiety, where the possibility of accusation can transform ordinary events into matters of life and death. The executions and imprisonment of 1692 illustrate the devastating consequences of fear, belief, and social dynamics. They show how ordinary people, operating within a religious and legal framework, can contribute to extraordinary suffering. The Salem Witch Trials provide a stark reminder of the human capacity for suspicion, judgment, and cruelty when fear becomes a dominant force. By late 1692, the fever of the Salem Witch Trials began to show signs of exhaustion. The initial wave of accusations, interrogations, imprisonments, and executions had swept through the village, leaving fear and trauma in its wake. Yet the momentum of hysteria could not last indefinitely. Skepticism and doubt started to take hold, challenging the authority of the Court of Oyer and Termina and altering the trajectory of the trials. The first cracks in the system appeared as some judges and ministers began to question the reliability of spectral evidence. Increase Mather, a prominent Puritan minister and scholar, wrote a treatise warning against relying solely on the testimony of afflicted children and visions that could not be corroborated. Mather argued that the devil could impersonate innocent people to deceive the faithful, meaning that spectral evidence could be misleading or false. His warnings, though not universally accepted at first, planted seeds of doubt in both legal and religious circles. Public opinion also began to shift. Families and neighbors who had once been eager to see justice done started to question the morality of the trials. Observing the executions of respected figures such as Rebecca Nurse and Giles Corey caused many villagers to reconsider the legitimacy of the accusations. The deaths of individuals known for their piety and integrity highlighted the arbitrary and dangerous nature of the proceedings. Whispers of injustice began circulating, and some townspeople openly expressed concern about the growing number of innocent victims. Even within the court, dissent was emerging. Some judges expressed private reservations about convictions based primarily on spectral evidence. There was a growing awareness that the system, once intended to protect the community, had become a vehicle for fear and personal vendetta. The combination of coerced confessions, child testimony, and social grievances was producing outcomes that many found morally and logically troubling. Governor William Phips, who had authorized the court of Oya and Termina, began to intervene as public concern increased. Reports from towns surrounding Salem Village highlighted growing unrest, and influential ministers such as Increase Mather pressed for reform. Phips, facing mounting pressure and alarmed by the number of executions, suspended the court in October 1692. This marked a turning point in the trials, signaling that the unchecked spread of fear and accusation could no longer continue without challenge. Following the suspension of the court, the process of releasing prisoners began. Those who had been imprisoned for months or even longer were gradually freed, though not without lingering fear and social stigma. Families had to navigate the aftermath of accusation, grappling with disrupted livelihoods, damaged reputations, and the psychological toll of prolonged anxiety. Many survivors faced ongoing suspicion, even after the immediate threat of execution had passed. One of the key changes during this period was the increased scrutiny of evidence. Judges and officials began to recognize the dangers of relying exclusively on spectral visions and unverified testimonies. New procedures emphasized corroboration, rational evaluation, and the protection of accused individuals' rights. This shift reflected a broader cultural recognition that fear, when combined with legal authority, could produce devastating consequences. The case of Anne Putnam Sire provides insight into the personal and communal dynamics that contributed to skepticism. Putnam, whose daughter had been among the afflicted, later expressed remorse for her role in the accusations. She acknowledged the influence of fear and social pressure in shaping her testimony, revealing the human dimension behind the hysteria. Many others, when reflecting on the events of 1692, expressed similar regret and sought ways to make amends. Another source of growing skepticism came from the broader Puritan leadership. Ministers and community leaders recognized that the Salem Witch Trials were creating divisions, undermining trust, and producing outcomes that contradicted moral and religious principles. Sermons and writings began emphasizing caution, rational judgment, and the dangers of overzealous accusations. The cultural and religious authority that had once fueled the trials now began to guide the community toward reflection and reform. The decline of the trials also coincided with changing social dynamics. Accusations had reached a point of diminishing returns, as more individuals were implicated, including respected and pious members of the community. The credibility of the process began to erode. Families who had once eagerly supported prosecutions began to voice concern. The realization that anyone could be accused, regardless of age, gender, social standing, or reputation, shifted public perception and encouraged a more cautious approach. By early 1693, the court of Oya and Termina had been replaced by a new court that no longer admitted spectral evidence. This legal reform reflected the culmination of growing skepticism, public concern, and the recognition that the previous system had produced grave injustices. Accusations continued in some form, but the pace slowed dramatically, and the likelihood of execution decreased. The shift marked the beginning of the end for the formal judicial proceedings associated with the Salem Witch Trials. The impact of growing skepticism extended beyond legal reforms. Families sought to rebuild trust, repair reputations, and restore social cohesion. The process was slow and fraught, as fear and suspicion had deeply affected the village's social fabric. Children who had testified were now encouraged to reflect on the consequences of their actions, and some confessed to exaggerating or inventing claims. These admissions, while difficult, helped to restore a measure of social balance. The broader cultural lesson of the decline of the trials was profound. The Salem Witch Trials demonstrated how fear, when combined with social pressure, religious fervor, and legal authority, could produce extraordinary and destructive outcomes. Yet the emergence of skepticism showed that reason, reflection, and moral conscience could eventually restore balance. Communities, when given space to reconsider, could recognize injustice and begin the difficult work of repair and reconciliation. Even as the immediate hysteria subsided, the legacy of the trials continued to shape Salem Village and the surrounding region. Survivors carried both psychological scars and social stigma. Families struggled to rebuild lives disrupted by accusation and imprisonment. Ministers and leaders reflected on the dangers of unchecked fear and the importance of balancing spiritual vigilance with reasoned judgment. These lessons would inform future generations, both in Massachusetts and beyond, about the potential consequences of mass hysteria and the human cost of fear-driven justice. In imagining this period of growing skepticism, picture Salem Village gradually returning to routine. Families resume daily work, though a shadow of caution lingers. Children who once testified reflect quietly on their actions. Neighbors cautiously rebuild trust, while ministers emphasize reflection, caution. The courthouse, once a site of relentless accusation, becomes a place of measured judgment. Fear remains present, but it is tempered by reason and the recognition of past mistakes. The decline of the Salem Witch Trials illustrates the interplay between social, religious, and legal forces. It shows how fear can escalate to extraordinary levels, how communities can participate in injustice, and how skepticism and reflection can eventually restore balance. The events of late 1692 and early 1693 reveal the capacity for both human error and human conscience, offering lessons that resonate far beyond the village of Salem. The process of recovery, reflection, and skepticism marked the final stage of the trial's immediate impact. While the trauma and consequences persisted, the shift from hysteria to reason represented a critical turning point in the narrative of Salem. The lessons learned during this period would resonate for decades, shaping both the cultural memory and legal practices in colonial Massachusetts, and serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, suspicion, and uncritical acceptance of authority. With the suspension of the Court of Oyer and Termina and the eventual decline of the Salem Witch Trials, the village of Salem and the surrounding communities faced the difficult task of grappling with the aftermath. Families, neighbors, and survivors had endured months of fear, accusation, and loss. The physical and psychological scars were deep, and the social fabric of the village had been stretched to its limits. Yet, the work of reconciliation and reflection would begin, shaping the historical memory of the events for generations to come. One of the earliest steps toward reconciliation involved the release of prisoners who had been accused but not yet tried. Families rejoiced as loved ones were freed, but relief was tempered by lingering fear and stigma. Many released individuals found it difficult to resume their former lives. Their homes had often been neglected or damaged during their imprisonment, and their property sometimes confiscated or sold. Re-establishing livelihoods required resilience, community support, and a cautious re-entry into social life. Survivors of imprisonment and those who had narrowly avoided execution faced the challenge of rebuilding trust within the community. Neighbors who had once been accusers or witnesses were now sources of unease. Relationships had been strained or broken, and the question of how to restore social cohesion became urgent. Villagers were forced to confront the consequences of past actions and to consider how fear and suspicion had led to unjust treatment of friends and family. The government of Massachusetts took steps to acknowledge the injustices committed during the trials. In the years following 1692, petitions and appeals for restitution emerged. Families of those who had been executed or imprisoned sought compensation for property losses, reputational damage, and emotional suffering. Some financial reparations were eventually granted, although these were often symbolic and could not undo the profound personal and communal harm inflicted during the hysteria. Religious leaders played a significant role in the reconciliation process. Ministers who had supported the trials or who had remained silent began to reflect publicly on the moral implications of their actions. Sermons emphasized forgiveness, humility, and the need for communal healing. Confessions of error and expressions of remorse helped to acknowledge wrongdoing and provided a framework for moral reflection. These efforts underscored the importance of both spiritual and social restoration. The broader Puritan community began to engage in introspection about the factors that had fueled the hysteria. leaders and scholars, such as Increase Mather and Cotton Mather, debated the role of spectral evidence, the reliability of child testimony, and the influence of social tensions. Their writings highlighted the need for procedural caution, rational evaluation, and the protection of individual rights in future cases. The reflections of these figures contributed to the development of a more cautious approach to legal and religious authority in colonial New England. Memorialization and acknowledgement of the victims emerged as part of the reconciliation process. Communities recognized the importance of remembering those who had suffered unjustly. In Salem, gravestones, public records, and later commemorative writings ensured that the names of the executed and imprisoned were preserved. By recording these stories, villagers acknowledged the human cost of hysteria and provided a historical lesson for future generations. The children involved in the trials, many of whom had served as primary witnesses, were encouraged to reflect on their roles. Some admitted to exaggeration or fabrication, acknowledging the pressure, fear, and social dynamics that had shaped their testimony. This acknowledgement, while difficult, became a vital step in restoring moral balance and understanding the human dimension of the events. Families of the accused also faced social and emotional challenges. Survivors often experienced ongoing suspicion or ostracism. Children who had lost parents or guardians were particularly vulnerable, needing the support of relatives or community members. Rebuilding social bonds required both personal effort and communal willingness to forgive and restore trust. In many cases, reconciliation was slow, gradual, and incomplete, yet the process itself was crucial for healing. The legal system underwent significant changes in response to the trials. Courts increasingly emphasized evidence that could be corroborated, and procedures were revised to prevent the use of spectral evidence. These reforms reflected a growing awareness of the dangers of fear-driven justice and the need to protect the rights of individuals. The lessons of Salem influenced both local and regional legal practices, shaping a more cautious and measured approach to accusations of witchcraft and other serious crimes. Psychologically, the aftermath of the trials was profound. Survivors experienced lasting trauma, grief, and anxiety. Communities were forced to confront the emotional consequences of widespread fear and suspicion. Counseling, moral guidance, and religious instruction became tools for coping with the collective trauma. The experiences of 1692 left a lasting imprint on the collective memory of the region, influencing attitudes toward justice, evidence, and social responsibility. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing was an important component of reconciliation. In 1697, the General Court of Massachusetts formally declared a day of fasting and repentance, acknowledging the errors of the trials. This act of public contrition signaled a shift in communal understanding, recognizing that fear and zeal had contributed to injustice. Religious leaders and civic authorities emphasized reflection, forgiveness, and moral vigilance to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The memory of the trials continued to shape the cultural identity of Salem and the surrounding region. Stories of the events were passed down through oral tradition, diaries, and historical records. Survivors' testimonies, family accounts, and ministerial reflections ensured that the human cost of hysteria was neither forgotten nor ignored. These narratives served as both a warning and a lesson, demonstrating how fear and suspicion, left unchecked, could devastate communities. Over time, the Salem Witch Trials became a symbol of the dangers of mass hysteria and the misuse of authority. The events provided a cautionary tale about the consequences of fear, religious zeal, and social tension. Historical analysis, literature, and public discourse have since examined the trials, highlighting the interplay of psychology, law, and society. The trials illustrate the importance of due process, skepticism, and the protection of individual rights, lessons that remain relevant to this day. Reconciliation also involved practical measures. Families received financial restitution. Where possible, community leaders mediated disputes, and religious institutions offered moral guidance. These steps helped to stabilize social life and provide a framework for rebuilding trust. While the scars of 1692 were deep, The combination of reflection, acknowledgement, and reform allowed the community to move forward. In reflecting on the aftermath, it is clear that the Salem Witch Trials were not simply a legal or religious event. They were a social and psychological crisis. The intersection of fear, belief, authority, and personal conflict created conditions in which ordinary individuals became both victims and actors. Understanding the aftermath requires appreciating the human experiences, the efforts at reconciliation, and the long-term impact on both individuals and the community. The process of reconciliation demonstrates the capacity for growth and moral reflection. Survivors, families, and community leaders recognize the consequences of past actions, sought forgiveness, and worked to restore social order. The acknowledgement of error, combined with legal reform and moral instruction, provided a path toward healing. The memory of the trials, preserved through documentation and oral tradition, ensured that the lessons learned would endure. Even today, the aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials offers insight into human behavior under pressure, the dangers of fear-driven judgment, and the potential for redemption and reconciliation. By studying the recovery process, we can better understand how societies cope with collective trauma, how individuals navigate moral responsibility, and how communities restore trust after periods of intense fear and suspicion. The Salem Witch Trials aftermath, encompassing imprisonment, execution, social disruption, legal reform, and moral reflection, demonstrates the complex interplay between human psychology, community dynamics, and institutional authority. It reminds us that even in the darkest periods of fear and hysteria, there exists the possibility for reflection, reconciliation, and learning. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 left a profound and lasting mark, not only on the village of Salem and its surrounding communities, but also on the broader cultural, social, and historical consciousness of America. Over the decades and centuries that followed, the events of that single harrowing year became emblematic of the dangers of fear, mass hysteria, and unchecked authority. Understanding the cultural legacy of Salem requires examining literature, education, public memory, and scholarly interpretation. One of the earliest and most influential interpretations of the trials appeared in the writings of Cotton Mather and Increase Mather. Cotton Mather, who had been involved in advising on the legal and religious dimensions of the trials, later reflected on the events in his work, Wonders of the Invisible World. While intended to justify the court's actions to some degree, the book also provides insight into the complex mixture of religious belief, social tension, and moral reasoning that underpinned the trials. Increase Mather, as mentioned earlier, emphasized caution in relying on spectral evidence and stressed the importance of moral reflection. Together, these writings set the stage for later interpretations, combining historical documentation with moral and theological reflection. Literature soon transformed the historical events of Salem into stories that carried moral and cultural weight. The most famous of these works is Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, written in 1953. Miller used the Salem witch trials as an allegory for the anti-communist witch hunts of his own time, drawing parallels between fear-driven accusations in the 1690s and the political persecution during the McCarthy era. While Miller took creative liberties with names, dates, and specific events, the play captures the essential human dynamics of fear, suspicion, and the consequences of mass hysteria. The Crucible became a seminal text in American theater, education, and cultural consciousness, ensuring that the story of Salem continued to resonate with new generations. Historical scholarship has also played a crucial role in shaping our understanding of Salem. Historians have analyzed the economic, social, religious, and psychological factors that contributed to the hysteria. Research highlights how land disputes, family rivalries, and social divisions intersected with Puritan religious beliefs to create fertile ground for accusations. Scholars examine the role of legal structures, including the use of spectral evidence, coercive interrogations, and procedural failures, in amplifying fear and injustice. This historical perspective moves beyond moralizing, providing a nuanced understanding of how ordinary people became entangled in extraordinary circumstances. The Salem Witch Trials have also become an enduring topic in education. Schools across the United States include the events and curricula covering early American history, colonial society, and the evolution of law and civil rights. Teachers emphasize both the human tragedy of the trials and the lessons about due process, skepticism, and critical thinking. Through classroom study, students learn to recognize the dangers of mass hysteria, the importance of evidence-based judgment, and the social dynamics that can lead to injustice. Public memory and commemoration of the Salem Witch Trials have further reinforced their cultural legacy. The town of Salem, Massachusetts, has become a center for historical tourism, with museums, walking tours, and interpretive exhibits dedicated to the events of 1692. Visitors can explore reconstructed courtrooms, visit the sites where accused individuals lived and were executed, and engage with interactive displays that contextualize the trials within broader colonial history. These efforts provide both education and reflection, allowing modern audiences to appreciate the human experiences behind historical accounts. Memorials and markers honor the victims and acknowledge the injustices they suffered. The Salem Witch Memorial, for example, commemorates the 20 victims who were executed and serves as a place for reflection and remembrance. Names are inscribed, stories are told, and the site encourages visitors to consider the consequences of fear-driven judgment. By memorializing the victims, the community ensures that their suffering is neither forgotten nor trivialized. The Salem Witch Trials have also inspired scholarship and debate about historical interpretation. Questions arise about the relative influence of social, religious, and psychological factors. Scholars explore whether the events were primarily driven by religious zeal, personal vendettas, economic pressures, or psychological phenomena, such as mass psychogenic illness. Each interpretation contributes to a richer understanding of the trials, demonstrating that historical events are rarely the result of a single cause. Instead, they emerge from complex interactions among multiple factors, including human belief, institutional authority, and social networks. In the modern era, the trials continue to serve as a cautionary tale. They are cited in discussions about civil liberties, judicial fairness, and the dangers of moral panic. Legal scholars and policymakers reference Salem when exploring the consequences of prejudice, fear-based legislation, or unverified evidence. The trials remind us that even well-intentioned authorities can make grievous errors when fear overrides reason, and they underscore the importance of safeguarding individual rights and due process. Cultural expressions of the Salem Witch Trials extend beyond literature and education. Art, film, and popular media frequently draw on the imagery and themes of the events. Paintings and illustrations depict the dramatic scenes of accusation and execution. Films, ranging from historical dramatizations to fantastical reinterpretations, explore the human and social dynamics of hysteria. Television documentaries and podcasts analyze the causes and consequences of the trials, reaching broad audiences and preserving the story in public consciousness. The trials have also influenced discussions about gender and power. Women were disproportionately accused, reflecting social anxieties about female behavior, independence, and influence. Scholars and cultural commentators explore how gendered dynamics contributed to accusations, how women navigated accusations and imprisonment, and how patriarchal structures influenced legal outcomes. Understanding these aspects adds another layer to the cultural interpretation of Salem, highlighting how social norms and power imbalances can exacerbate fear-driven injustice. Psychologically, the Salem Witch Trials offer insight into human behavior under stress and fear. The events illustrate how communities can be swayed by rumor, how individuals may participate in injustice to protect themselves, and how collective anxiety can escalate rapidly. Contemporary studies of social psychology, mass hysteria, and moral panic often reference Salem as a case study, demonstrating its relevance to understanding both historical and modern phenomena. The enduring legacy of the trials also includes lessons in resilience and recovery. Survivors, families, and communities learn to navigate the aftermath, rebuild trust, and reflect on moral responsibility. The process of reconciliation, acknowledgement, and reform provides a model for addressing collective trauma. Modern societies continue to draw on these lessons when confronting crises that test social cohesion, moral judgment, and the rule of law. In addition to historical and educational significance, the trials continue to inspire moral and ethical reflection. They encourage consideration of how fear, prejudice, and power can intersect, often with devastating consequences. Communities and individuals are reminded of the importance of vigilance, skepticism, and compassion in evaluating accusations and administering justice. The story of Salem serves as a moral mirror, reflecting both human vulnerability and the capacity for reflection and reform. In imagining the cultural legacy of Salem, picture modern visitors walking the streets of the town, reading historical plaques, visiting museums, and reflecting on the lives affected by hysteria. Imagine students studying primary documents, analyzing the causes and effects, and discussing the ethical lessons. Imagine communities acknowledging past wrongs, memorializing victims, and using history to inform decisions about justice and fairness. The legacy of Salem is alive not just in memory, but in ongoing reflection, education, and moral consideration. Ultimately, the cultural legacy and historical interpretation of the Salem Witch Trials demonstrate the enduring power of history to inform, caution, and inspire. The events of 1692 continue to resonate because they reveal fundamental truths about human behavior, the allure of fear, the dangers of unverified authority, and the consequences of moral panic. At the same time, they show the potential for reflection, understanding, and reconciliation. Salem is a story of both tragedy and enduring lesson, reminding us that history, when remembered and studied carefully, has the power to guide future generations. As we consider the Salem witch trials today, it becomes clear that their significance extends far beyond the village of Salem in 1692. The events provide a mirror for human behavior, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, and a lens through which to examine law, society, and psychology. Modern reflections on the trials reveal lessons that remain deeply relevant, not only for historians, but for anyone seeking to understand the consequences of moral panic, mass hysteria, and unchecked authority. One of the most striking modern interpretations of Salem is its connection to psychology and social behavior. Scholars studying mass hysteria, groupthink, and moral panic often cite the trials as a clear example of how fear can spread rapidly and distort judgment. In Salem, ordinary people, neighbors, friends, and family became both witnesses and participants in a system that produced extraordinary injustice. Fear, amplified by social pressure, authority, and religious belief, created conditions in which rational decision-making was suspended. Today, this serves as a lesson in understanding how emotions, rumors, and social dynamics can drive collective behavior, sometimes with catastrophic results. The trials also offer insight into the mechanisms of scapegoating and blame. Individuals and groups under stress often look for someone to hold responsible, and in Salem, women, marginalized individuals, and social outsiders were disproportionately accused. The pattern demonstrates how existing social tensions, economic pressures, and personal grievances can intersect with fear to target vulnerable populations. Modern societies can learn from this example, recognizing the importance of protecting minority groups, upholding legal safeguards, and resisting the urge to attribute complex problems to a single cause or person. Legal scholars continue to examine Salem for lessons about justice and due process. The trials highlight the dangers of relying on unverified evidence, coerced confessions, and testimonial exaggeration. In particular, the reliance on spectral evidence claims that a spirit or vision caused harm, served as a vivid reminder of how subjective or unverifiable claims can influence legal outcomes. Modern legal systems emphasize evidence-based proceedings precisely because history has shown the consequences of failure. Salem demonstrates the critical need for transparency, fairness, and rational evaluation in judicial processes. The trials also provide enduring lessons about the intersection of religion and governance. In colonial Salem, religious authority and social norms were deeply intertwined with legal proceedings. Ministers and church leaders shaped public perception, advised the courts and influenced communal judgment. While their intentions were often framed in moral terms, the result was a system that allowed fear and dogma to dictate life and death decisions. Today, the Salem Witch Trials serve as a cautionary tale about maintaining a separation between moral authority, personal belief, and state power, highlighting the importance of balancing faith with reason in civic life. Education has played a key role in preserving and interpreting the lessons of Salem. Schools and universities continue to teach the trials as a case study in history, ethics, law, and social psychology. By analyzing the causes and consequences of the hysteria, students learn about the human capacity for fear, the importance of critical thinking, and the dangers of conformity under pressure. The story of Salem teaches more than facts and dates. It teaches reflection, ethical reasoning, and an awareness of the fragility of justice when communities succumb to fear. The modern cultural impact of the trials is also evident in literature, film, and popular media. Works ranging from Arthur Miller's The Crucible to contemporary documentaries explore themes of fear, accusation, and moral responsibility. Films dramatize the tension, psychological pressure, and human suffering of the period, while historians provide context and analysis. Podcasts, historical websites, and interactive exhibits allow broader audiences to engage with the story, ensuring that the lessons of Salem remain accessible and relevant. Gender dynamics, too, remain an important focus of modern reflection. Women bore the brunt of accusations in 1692, reflecting societal anxieties about female authority, independence, and influence. Contemporary scholars and activists examine how these gendered patterns of suspicion and blame resonate in different contexts, exploring parallels in workplace dynamics, political scapegoating, and cultural stereotypes. Understanding the gendered aspects of Salem helps modern audiences recognize and challenge structural inequalities that persist today. Psychological studies of the trials have revealed how suggestion, fear, and peer pressure influence perception and behavior. Children's testimonies, often dramatic and emotionally charged, played a central role in escalating accusations. The social and psychological environment encouraged exaggeration, conformity, and the internalization of fear. In modern terms, the events of Salem provide a window into phenomena such as group conformity, the power of authority figures, and the social transmission of anxiety. These lessons are applicable to understanding modern crises, from workplace dynamics to political movements, where fear and rumor can spread rapidly. The trials also serve as a reminder of the importance of reconciliation and moral reflection. In the years following 1692, the survivors, families, and communities engaged in acts of acknowledgement, restitution, and reflection. Financial reparations, public confessions, and commemorative efforts allowed the community to rebuild trust and restore social cohesion. Modern societies can draw lessons from these efforts, recognizing the value of accountability, apology, and restorative justice in the aftermath of social trauma. Salem has also influenced contemporary approaches to governance and the protection of civil liberties. The recognition that unchecked fear and authority can lead to mass injustice has informed the development of legal safeguards, procedural standards, and protections for individual rights. Modern constitutions, court systems, and human rights frameworks incorporate lessons that echo the consequences of 1692, emphasizing due process, evidence-based judgment, and protection against arbitrary punishment. Art, public memory, and tourism continue to shape the narrative of Salem. Museums, walking tours, and commemorative events preserve the story and encourage reflection. Visitors engage with the history of the trials, exploring the lives of victims, the social context of accusations, and the legal and moral questions that arose. Through these experiences, the cultural memory of Salem remains vivid, providing both education and moral contemplation for modern audiences. In addition, the Salem Witch Trials remind us of the potential for fear and suspicion to recur in other forms. From political witch hunts to moral panics around social issues, the human tendencies that fueled the events of 1692 persist. By studying the trials, we learn to recognize the warning signs, the role of rumor, the amplification of fear, the targeting of vulnerable groups, and the erosion of rational judgment. These lessons encourage vigilance, skepticism, and a commitment to fairness in contemporary life. Modern psychology, law, education, and culture all intersect in the legacy of Salem. The trials offer insight into human vulnerability, social influence, and the consequences of collective panic. They remind us that fear, if left unchecked, can overwhelm reason, distort justice, and produce profound human suffering. At the same time, the response to the aftermath, reflection, acknowledgement, reform, and education illustrates the potential for learning, healing, and moral growth. In imagining modern reflections on Salem, picture classrooms analyzing primary documents, communities visiting memorials, scholars debating causes and consequences, and media exploring stories of accusation, courage, and redemption. Picture legal experts studying procedural failures, psychologists examining social dynamics, and cultural historians preserving the narrative. The story of Salem, though rooted in 1692, lives on as a source of guidance, reflection, and understanding for generations far removed from the original events. The Salem Witch Trials, when viewed through a modern lens, are more than historical events. They are enduring lessons about human behavior, social dynamics, and moral responsibility. They teach us about the dangers of fear, the importance of rational judgment, and the consequences of mass hysteria. They remind us to protect vulnerable populations, uphold individual rights, and balance authority with skepticism. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate the human capacity for reflection, reconciliation, and the pursuit of justice even after profound failure. As we consider the story of Salem today, we recognize that the trials are both a warning and a lesson. They remind us that history is not merely a record of events, but a source of insight into the human condition. The fears, mistakes, and suffering of 1692 resonate because they reflect patterns that can emerge anywhere, at any time. Through remembrance, study, and reflection, we honor the victims, understand the dynamics of hysteria, and equip ourselves to prevent similar injustices in the future. As we reach the end of our journey through the Salem Witch Trials, it is worth pausing to reflect on the story as a whole, the lessons it teaches, and the enduring relevance it holds for all of us. The events of 1692 were more than a sequence of accusations and executions. They were a profound exploration of human nature, community dynamics, and the fragile balance between fear and reason. In the months of hysteria that swept through Salem village, ordinary people were transformed into witnesses, accusers, and victims. Children's testimony carried life or death weight, neighbors turned on one another, and respected ministers grappled with spiritual and legal authority. Fear dominated daily life, and yet beneath the terror, we can see traces of courage, conscience, and reflection. Survivors, families, and leaders eventually faced the task of grappling with injustice, rebuilding trust, and seeking understanding. The trials remind us of the consequences of mass hysteria. They show how fear, when combined with social tension, personal vendettas, and institutional authority, can escalate into extraordinary injustice. Spectral evidence, coercion, and unverified accusations became tools in a system that failed to protect the innocent. Modern audiences, looking back, recognize the profound human cost of these errors and the dangers of allowing fear to override reason. The story of Salem also teaches the importance of skepticism and critical thinking. Increased Mather's warnings about spectral evidence and the unreliability of visions serve as an early example of reason pushing back against hysteria. Today, we understand that questioning assumptions, seeking corroboration, and protecting individual rights are fundamental safeguards against injustice. The lessons of 1692 remind us that vigilance is necessary to prevent fear from distorting judgment. Another enduring lesson is the importance of reconciliation. After the court was suspended and the hysteria began to subside, families and communities faced the challenge of repairing relationships, restoring trust, and acknowledging wrongdoing. Survivors and victims' families sought restitution, ministers reflected on their roles, and communities commemorated those who had suffered. This process of moral and social repair illustrates how societies can recover from collective trauma, even when scars remain. The Salem Witch Trials also offer insight into social dynamics and human psychology. Gender, status, and social tensions played critical roles in determining who was accused and who escaped suspicion. Women, marginalized individuals, and those with existing grievances were disproportionately targeted. Understanding these dynamics helps modern audiences recognize the influence of social hierarchies, prejudice, and fear on decision-making and collective behavior. Legal and procedural lessons are equally significant. The trials demonstrate the dangers of unverified evidence, coercion, and undue influence in judicial processes. They illustrate why modern legal systems prioritize due process, evidence-based judgment, and protections for the accused. The reforms that followed Salem, including the rejection of spectral evidence and the emphasis on corroboration, helped prevent similar miscarriages of justice in the colony and set precedents for future legal standards. Culturally, Salem has become a symbol. Through literature, theatre, film, and historical scholarship, the events have been remembered, interpreted, and re-examined. Arthur Miller's The Crucible transformed the trials into a cautionary allegory for political persecution, while historians have analyzed the events to understand human behavior and social forces. Museums, memorials, and educational programs continue to engage the public, ensuring that the lessons of 1692 remain vivid and relevant. Reflecting on Salem also invites us to consider the universality of its lessons: mass hysteria, fear-driven persecution, scapegoating, and the abuse of authority are not confined to a single village or century. Throughout history, societies have faced similar crises, and the human tendencies revealed in Salem continue to surface in political, social, and cultural contexts. By studying the trials, we equip ourselves to recognize the warning signs of injustice and to respond with reason, empathy, and moral courage. In imagining the village of Salem today, one can picture the streets quiet once more, families rebuilding, and memorials honoring the past. Visitors reflect on the lives disrupted, the innocence lost, and the lessons learned. Scholars continue to debate causes and consequences, while communities preserve the memory of those who suffered. Salem stands as both a historical record and a moral guide, reminding us that human fear, unchecked by reason, can have devastating consequences, but that reflection, reconciliation, and education can heal and illuminate. The story of Salem encourages introspection. It asks us to examine our own responses to fear, authority, and social pressure. It challenges us to consider how we might act in moments of uncertainty, to weigh evidence carefully, and to protect the vulnerable. The trials demonstrate that ordinary people, even with good intentions, can participate in extraordinary injustice, but they also show that individuals and communities can reflect, repent, and seek to restore balance. Education, reflection, and cultural preservation ensure that the lessons of Salem continue to resonate. By studying the events, examining the human and social dynamics, and engaging with memorials and literature, modern audiences can understand the complexities of fear, power, and justice. These lessons are not merely historical, they are applicable in classrooms, courtrooms, workplaces, and communities around the world. In closing, the Salem Witch Trials serve as both warning and guidance. They warn of the dangers inherent in fear-driven decisions, unverified accusations, and unchecked authority. They guide us toward reason, empathy, moral responsibility, and the careful consideration of evidence. The story of Salem encourages a commitment to justice, a recognition of human vulnerability, and an understanding that reflection and reconciliation are essential to communal well-being. As the night falls over Salem in our imagination, and as we reflect on the events of 1692, we can hear the echoes of lessons that remain relevant. The fear, hysteria, and suffering of the village are tempered by the courage, conscience, and reflection that followed. From the trials and their aftermath emerges a story not just of tragedy, but of enduring wisdom, reminding us of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and reason in our own lives. The Salem Witch Trials, in their entirety, are a testament to both the fragility and resilience of human society. They reveal how fear and suspicion can consume communities, but also how acknowledgement, reconciliation, and moral reflection can restore balance. In studying, remembering, and reflecting on these events, we honor the past, learn from its lessons, and equip ourselves to navigate the challenges of fear and uncertainty in the present and future. The story of Salem is a story for all time, a reminder that human actions guided by fear or courage, reason or prejudice leave lasting consequences. As we drift into quiet reflection, we carry with us the lessons of 1692, the importance of critical thought, the dangers of mass hysteria, the value of compassion, and the enduring power of moral conscience. In remembering Salem, we ensure that history's warning and guidance remain alive, whispering their lessons across centuries.